Okay. As you all know, we're continuing our study of the minor prophets. I think this is the 8th one out of 12, so we're getting sort of close to the end of this study. You might want to start thinking about what, if anything, you want to study next. It's not quite time to wrestle with that subject, but you could start thinking about it. Last week we finished the minor prophet Nahum, and tonight, as it says on the slide, we're starting Habakkuk, and we'll cover tonight just chapter 1. We may have extra time tonight, so if you feel like asking questions or saying something, tonight's a good night for that, I suppose. I think it helps when studying Habakkuk to know ahead of time that you can kind of divide, and people normally have divided the book into two main parts. Chapters 1 and 2 are a sort of dialogue or conversation between God and the prophet Habakkuk. And then chapter 3 actually has a superscription which calls it Habakkuk's prayer, but it has some musical notation like we see sometimes in the Psalms about instruments and musical styles that might be used to perform it. And so it could be a prayer or a song or a prayer that gets sung. People don't really know. But there are those two main parts of it. And the very first verse, chapter 1, verse 1, and the very first verse of chapter 3, verse 1, are superscriptions or titles or subtitles which tell you what's coming. I'll say this again, but verse 1 of chapter 1, people wonder whether it's a title for the whole 3 chapters or just for the first 2 chapters. Clearly, the first verse of chapter 3 is just describing chapter 3. Probably the best way to think is the first one is the general title, and the one at the start of chapter 3 is a kind of subtitle, marking off the prayer, a song that ends the book. So do keep that in mind, and tonight, of course, will be in the first of these 2 parts, the dialogue between God and Habakkuk. Regarding the dialogue between God and Habakkuk, it has sort of 2 cycles or 4 parts, however you want to think about it. It begins with Habakkuk speaking, and then with God responding, and then Habakkuk speaking again, and God responding again. Most often people have spoken of this as Habakkuk's complaint number 1 and complaint number 2, and then God's answer back to him. Complaint might be a slightly harsh word, as you'll see. I don't think the prophet is ever rude or ungodly, but he is confused and upset by things that he sees in life, like Job was and like David was and like many other godly people in the Bible are sometimes upset by what they see, and brings these things to God, and God responds to him in these first 2 chapters of Habakkuk. And tonight we will not go into chapter 2, except that I do want to read at the end of tonight, before we quit, I want to read the first verse of chapter 2, because to me that's the end of Habakkuk's complaint. At the very first verse of chapter 2, Habakkuk says, okay, I'm going to get up on the wall and wait and see how God is going to answer me. And so that's a fitting end to his complaint. And then next week, as we read on into chapter 2, we'll see how God answers Habakkuk's second complaint. So I'm sorry to end on a note of complaint tonight, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. All right, so open up Habakkuk to the beginning, and let's see what we've got here. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 1 says, and I've got the whole verse for this one up on the slide. It says, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. And we had the same word at the beginning of Nahum. If you'll remember, there it was talked about the oracle to Nahum concerning Nineveh. Remember the same word? Here as there, the same translations issues exist. The King James Version calls this the burden that he saw. The more modern translations call it the oracle that he saw. And remember last week we talked about an oracle as sort of authoritative, divine pronouncement. People have a question or they want to know something from God, and the oracle gives that to them. Oracle has a sense of being mysterious and not necessarily always in plain speech, but some kind of an answer coming back from the other side, from God, from heaven. Again, we have the same word here. Habakkuk is the name of the guy to whom the oracle comes, the name of the prophet. His name is Habakkuk. Really, the only thing we know about Habakkuk is what we read in the book titled Habakkuk. There's no other information about him available in the Bible or outside. Yeah?
With the oracle, I mean, it's like he writes this, then he sends it out to his other followers or disciples, and they go out and just read this in various villages and stuff, and so it's just all proclaimed at one time, or as close as possible, like their form of the internet.
Well, no, I mean, I don't. To a lot of to the question you just asked, I think everyone would have to say we don't know. But we actually, in case of Nahum and Habakkuk, we know something because the Bible tells us something. In case of Nahum, we were told the first sentence was it was an oracle concerning Nineveh, and it said it was a book that he wrote, right? And so people understand from that superscription in Nahum that Nahum was a truly written prophecy, that it didn't exist sort of orally, he didn't run around and say it. It actually came into existence as we have it when he sat down to write it. And so he's a truly writing prophet. After the book existed, I would presume that it was transmitted, I mean, all through all these centuries to us, and so it was passed through the generations, probably kept among priests and prophets and handed down. And the Jews, I guess I can also say, the way that stuff got transmitted, mostly it was read. So if you look at Jewish commentaries on these books, they'll say first reading, second reading, third reading. There's a time in the year when they'll read it, there's a circumstance where they'll read it, and they won't sort of pick and choose how many verses do they read at one time. These all get read at one time, and those all get read at one time. And so if I were a rabbi instead of a Christian, church member, I'd probably say, well, tonight we're sort of covering the first natural reading in Habakkuk, or maybe the first 2 weeks we are, and chapter 3 would be all read together. So I think they're read out to people is how they get transmitted. Here, we're actually told that, and this is a good question, thank you, is he says here that it was the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. And this is the same kind of language you get at the beginning of Revelation, the apocalypse told to the Apostle John. We understood there, he sat down at Patmos or wherever he was, John did, and God came to him in a vision. So he saw Jesus among the churches and all of that. And we get the idea, or in the case of Peter in Acts chapter 10, I think it is, there are several places in the Bible where the prophet or the apostle sees, God causes them to see something in a visionary sort of way of seeing. And that's the sense that we have here. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw, I think the best way to understand this, and that's why I have the picture up here on the slide, is he is sitting there having a vision, and the way that we know what his vision was is that he wrote it down, probably not simultaneously, but after he had the vision, he would have written it down the way John did with the apocalypse, and then after he wrote it down, they could read it out in churches and stuff, right? So, and I don't think printing press and stuff like that being so rudimentary as it was, most people would have heard scripture by reading, by listening, rather than by buying a copy of the scroll, which probably wasn't available for everybody, right? And that's probably important to remember, that a lot of this material was generated for the original audience that was going to listen to it, read repeatedly throughout their lifetime. They would hear this stuff read. All right, so here in verse 1, we know it's an oracle. We know the guy who the oracle came to is Habakkuk. We know, as we just said, that he had a vision that he then wrote down. We know that he was a prophet because of the way the language is stated. It's written to people who would have recognized him described this way. He's not a prophet named Habakkuk. He's Habakkuk the prophet. That means that they would have recognized the name, possibly of more than one person, but they would have only known of one Habakkuk who was the prophet. And so in his time, he was the guy named Habakkuk who was the prophet, and that has suggested to most commentators that he was kind of an official prophet, associated with the temple or in the priestly class, or maybe even a musician. There's some sense that music, like for example the Psalms of David, are prophetic. And since chapter 3 has musical instructions, it could have been he was a rather musical sort of a prophet. But anyway, he had some official recognition in Judah as being the prophet whose name was Habakkuk. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll just move on, is that it is interesting that although this is the vision that Habakkuk the prophet saw, and it's accorded the status of prophecy, it's part of the book of 12, the scroll containing the 12 minor prophets. Christians and Jews have always recognized this as being prophecy. Almost all of the words in here, not all, but almost all of the words in here are Habakkuk's own words. He's complaining to God, he's praying to God, he's singing to God, he's praising God and building doxologies of God. But it's actually a human being saying a bunch of stuff which has been recognized by the church of all time as prophecy, which is maybe the reason why the Psalms in our Bible have such a high sort of status. I mean, they started out as just a songbook, songs that people sang. But over time it came to be understood that these songs, which are basically people expressing their love of God, their frustration to God, their confusion about God, and so forth and so on, somehow God had inspired their very questioning, their very praising, their very commenting. And so it's prophecy, but it's also human speech also. That's worth thinking about. Various people point that out. I guess it's unusual among the prophets in being that way. Not a lot of "Thus saith the Lord." It's sort of Habakkuk speaking in an inspired way. Now, you find yourself wanting to know, where does Habakkuk sit on the timeline with the northern and southern kingdom and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and all of that, just because we're reading all of the minor prophets together and that history keeps marching along with us. And so at least some of you would probably want to think about that. And I can say that there's not a lot of strong, precise consensus about the timing of when Habakkuk was a prophet, because we don't have information about who was a king in Judah then and exactly what was happening with the Assyrians and the Babylonians when he wrote, so forth. But you can tell something for sure. If you look at chapter 1, verse 6, it says, and this is now God speaking, this is a bit of God speech, and it says, "For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation." And Chaldeans is just another word at this approximate point in history for Babylonians. It was the Chaldeans who had come into power in the seat of power, which had been Babylon over many centuries. There were millennia, time during which Babylon enters and exits the stage of powerful nations. But at this point in history, they were also the Chaldeans, called the Chaldeans. And so we know then that the time of his vision, the time when he received the vision, what he saw in his vision was something in the vision that was seen at the time before the Chaldeans rose, because within his vision, God is saying he's raising up the Chaldeans. And we also know from history outside the Bible and in, that the rise of the Chaldeans coincides almost perfectly with the decline of the Assyrians. It's almost the very year when Nineveh falls. A few years later, Assyria is almost not even existing as a nation state anymore, and the Babylonians are in control. All right? And so one of the things I can tell you with some confidence about the timing is that his vision looks at a time when the Assyrians are still in power, but the Babylonians are coming. Okay, and that background may be worth worth having as we read the prophecy. But I would say this: there are people who are obsessively interested in predictions and fulfillments of predictions when it comes to biblical prophecy, and that's okay. That's part of what we're studying here. But fulfillment of specific predictions are not the only thing we learn from biblical prophets, or even the most important thing that we learn from biblical prophets. What the biblical prophets are inviting us to do is to understand the character of God, to understand the character of man, and to understand the nature of the relationship between God and man. The historical predictions and fulfillments are examples But the truths about God's character and about human beings and God's plans for us in eternity, all of that's very permanent. I mean, God doesn't change and those things don't change. So every prophet is giving us a glimpse of this eternal reality of God, which in the end winds up being a lot more important than a lot of little details about what are in the grand scheme of things, brief patches in history when this or that country happened to be in charge. So to illustrate what I mean is in the New Testament times we know that Habakkuk was read because Paul quotes from Habakkuk in Galatians, he quotes from Habakkuk in Revelation, the author of the letter to the Hebrews quotes from Habakkuk, and by that time what they were getting from this book was nothing about the details of Assyria and Babylon. What they were getting was the fact that it is very important that people live by faith in God, no matter what. The lessons of this prophet for the ages are that we have to have faith in God, even when the world around us looks pretty awful, right? That's the voice that comes out from Habakkuk, and that's the voice that Paul and other New Testament people picked from Habakkuk, the importance of living by faith. And that we'll see in next week's lesson especially. All right, so we know the guy who's the oracle. We know how it's coming to him in a vision. He's written it down. We know about what time he's writing, the 7th century BC, about the time when the Assyrians are on the downslide and the Babylonians are on the upslide. And he's got truth for the ages as well as some specific things to say about the time that he lives in. All right, now, verses 2 through 14, as I had up on an earlier slide, I've outlined, most people would outline as being the verses that describe Habakkuk's first complaint to God. Now let me just read verses, sorry, I meant to say 2 through 4, did I say 14? Anyway, 2 through 4. Let me just read Habakkuk verses 2 through 4. Chapter 1. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Right. So this again is the voice of the prophet Habakkuk. He's within his vision where he's having a discussion with God, later written down. But it's within his intimate private vision, this sort of interior communication with God. This isn't a dispute out in public. This is between the prophet and his God in a vision. He's complaining to God in a sense. It's not a bad word to say that it's a complaint of some sort. But mark carefully, he's not complaining on his own behalf. This is not, at this stage, a selfish complaint. He's not upset because bad things are happening to him or because he wanted things that he can't have or that he is embarrassed that other nations are trampling on Israel, anything like that. He's complaining on behalf of goodness itself. He's complaining on behalf of godness itself. He's God's prophet. He knows what is right and what is wrong because he's allied with the creator of the universe, with God, which is the source of all goodness, right? And he looks at the world around him and he looks at the God that he knows he serves, and there's a radical discrepancy, right? He doesn't understand why this is happening, right? All sin is sin against God by definition. And the law, which he says is paralyzed, is the law which God gave to Israel to avoid precisely the sort of conditions which he sees around him. The justice which is perverted is the very justice which God commands his people to have in their dealings with other nations, and they're dealing with one another and before his face. Right? And so Habakkuk is God's prophet speaking to his God sort of privately within a vision and saying, God, please set things right. And part of his complaint really is that God has allowed these things to happen in the first place, maybe, but certainly we get the sense that he's saying this has gone on long enough. Why do you allow these things to continue, God, knowing what kind of God you are? And I think this is the heart of every human being who's a child of God, isn't it? I mean, is there anybody here who hasn't found themselves feeling this way, sometimes? Right? Is it wrong to say this kind of stuff to God? David did. He was a man after God's own heart. Job did. God said to Satan, "Have you seen my servant Job? He's blameless in all his ways." It seems like the people who are closest to God complain to God this way the most, and their grief is not selfish or ungodly or rude or disrespectful. On the contrary, they really are kind of defensive of God in a way. They don't think it's right that things should be this way, given that they understand God's character, right? And so that's the first complaint that comes out from Habakkuk, this kind of complaint, which, if you think about it, is not so rare. It's the same complaint you hear by David and Job and Jeremiah. It's not even far away from some of the words you hear on the lips of Christ. I mean, he had a time when he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Human beings who live in a sinful world who are children of a perfectly good God are going to feel the discrepancy sometimes. And if we feel it, we're in good company. So, a kind of interesting question, which I struggled with, I should say, I changed my mind from what I first thought in preparing for this class is, in verses 2 through 4, who stands accused in the eyes of Habakkuk? Is it foreign powers, specifically Assyria? Remember, we've just been with Nahum, and we read all about the downfall of Nineveh and how wicked they were and how God was going to judge them. We know that the Babylonians will rise and throw down the Assyrians because they had been so wicked. They've taken the whole northern kingdom of Israel away forever. I mean, they've really traumatized God's people. They're assaulting Judah from the south and from the west. They're up to the gates of Jerusalem. There's all kind of bad stuff the Assyrians are doing, and so there are several good Bible commentators who read through this, and what they see in verses 2 through 4 of chapter 1 of Habakkuk is the prophet inveighing against Assyria. Right? There's been a complaint by the prophet that all this wickedness is going on, and it's the fault of the evil Assyrians who have besieged them and bothered them, and now God is saying, okay, we'll take care of that. We'll send the Babylonians to wipe them out, which brings us very close to the orbit of Nahum, which was sort of saying stuff like that, right? However, all of the stuff said in verses 2 through 4 could also be said about the rich and the powerful people in Israel. Most of the prophets we've been studying in this class, among the minor prophets, are preaching against Israel, against Judah, against especially the priests and the rich landowners and the prophets and the powerful people who are abusing the poor and are corrupt, the judges who aren't administering justice. And so, because that's a predominant theme in the minor prophets, and because it's certainly all of these things would be truly said about the people in Judah in the time that Habakkuk was a prophet, other people, equally good Bible scholars but different ones, have read these same verses as referring to the nation of Israel itself. Violent, unrighteous, unjust, sinful, perverted. And one point in favor of viewing this as being a prophetic voice against Israel itself is the last bit, verse 4, which talks about the law being paralyzed and justice never going forth, is the sort of thing that might not be that aptly applied to Assyrians. They never signed up for the whole law and justice thing. They weren't. That wasn't their deal, They were pillaging and plundering wherever they could go and pillage and plunder, and they were proud of it. So that's why some people think, and I'm tending to agree now, I'm changing my mind from what I first thought this was about the Assyrians, but I think it's at least as much or more so about Israel, because the law that's paralyzed is God's law, and the justice that's perverted is God's justice. And that's probably something that Israel's more guilty of than the nations are.
If you get the throes of the enemy right there at the wall of Jerusalem, aren't you going to go more of a survival state? You're not really keen on a lot of peace, and so there's probably a crumbling of order. You don't have a stable society. People are probably looking at exit signs.
They are, and I think even and you get a lot of detail in the Bible, in Kings and Chronicles. One of the things that they're doing is they're trying to come up with all these weird alliances with Egypt. So they're wheeling and dealing, and they're trying to rely on their own strength and political alliances, and thinking that somehow they're going to be able to withstand these powerful enemies from the north, and they're not able to. Right? And what they should do, and what the godly people do, is turn back to God and say, God, help me. And that's their salvation. But what they mostly do, especially the leaders and the people in charge, they try to rely on their own wisdom, cook up their own deals, like you said, and they're not that interested in God or in peace. Probably they're interested in survival. Yeah, that's probably a fair statement. So here I'm just saying, if you imagine the first complaint of Habakkuk, is he complaining against the Assyrian enemy? Is he complaining against the wickedness within Israel? In some sense, he's complaining against God for allowing all of this to happen, but I would suggest it's a very different sense at this stage. It's complaining in a whole different sense, like I've tried to explain. He's frustrated and he's confused and stuff. Disappointed maybe even, but he's not ungodly or wicked. This isn't a sort of satanic rage directed at God. And I think if you look at the foreign powers or the wickedness in Israel thing, what you could say, and what I tend to do, is it's both. The whole point really of this prophet and of the Bible is everyone except Jesus Christ is a sinner, right? Outside the nation, inside the nation. There's sin enough to go around in Israel and outside of Israel. There's wickedness enough inside of Israel and outside of Israel. And it's not that strange that a child of God, a prophet of God like Habakkuk would, in his private time with God, say, God, why? Why are you allowing this stuff to happen? So, but you can think whichever of those two or both you think is correct. And again, you've got to hear the voice of Job and David and other people who have just been unable to explain things. And God often says to them, my ways are higher than your ways. Deal with it. I can't explain to you right now, but they're going to get some explanation. All right, verses 5 through 11 then is the first response of God to the first complaint of Habakkuk. And I'll read that. Verses 5 through 11, this is the Lord's answer to Habakkuk's complaint. And God says this. Or I should say, Habakkuk in his vision hears God saying this. Okay. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like eagles, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, at the rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. They sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. Okay, and so we get this sweep of imagery, not so different than we had last week in Nahum when the battles and stuff were described to us. And the point that we're supposed to get, and we do get here, is that the Chaldeans, that is the Babylonians, are a pretty fierce bunch. And they're coming, and they're violent, and they're immoral, and they're godless, and they're aggressive, and they're acquisitive, and they're going to do a lot of damage. Right, and so we just had Habakkuk's view of the world in our eyes. He's complaining to God because he sees so much evil around him. He's complaining to God because God isn't doing anything. And now God says, I am doing something. Look, behold. The word look and behold, they're a couple of verses apart. God is saying, let's look and see, what it is that I'm doing. I'm doing something, and what I am doing, is raising the Chaldeans. The Babylonians are going to come up and do all of this horrible stuff, and I am doing that, God says. Not quite the answer Habakkuk was expecting. So, he says to see what I'm doing, you have to look out among the nations. He's not asking them to look inside Israel at this point. He's saying what I'm doing is something you want to look out among the nations, verse 5, and see. God expects them to be filled with wonder and astonishment. It's not something that's going to be easy for them. In fact, God says they wouldn't even believe it if he told them. It's beyond their ability to understand what he's doing. Right? And what he's doing is he's raising up the Babylonians. And remember, these are the same Babylonians that are finally going to tear down Jerusalem, grab the leadership of Israel, and take the country into exile for a while. This is what God is raising up. And he says so in answer to the complaint of Habakkuk that he is not doing anything. So what do we think about this surprising answer? One of the complaints, or possibly one of the ways to remember Habakkuk's complaint, is that he's complaining about the Assyrians. Nahum was also. And by raising up the Babylonians, clearly, God is making good on his promise to put the Assyrians away. So that's fulfillment of biblical prophecy. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because while the Assyrians are put down, the Babylonians are raised up. Right? But the Babylonians are raised up to keep the threat against God's children in Israel, which are suffering from all kinds of moral corruption and injustice and the like, right? Which is a continuation of the same program God's been running to try to purify his own people. So both of those complaints are actually, from God's point of view, answered by the raising up of the Babylonians. The Assyrians are put away, and the wickedness of Judah is being prosecuted still, albeit by a new instrument, no longer the Assyrians, now by the Babylonians. And so God is not inactive, he's active, he's doing this amazing thing. He's consistent with his own word, but it's not removing the problem that Habakkuk was pointing to in terms of violence and injustice and all of that. Right. So this is the problem, that they call, what's the fancy word, Michael? Theodicy is the word, the theological term. Theodicy, the problem of why there's wickedness and evil in a universe that's ruled by an all-powerful good God. It's a problem that Jews and Christians have contended with from the beginning of Jews and Christians, right? We look at the world around us, we see evil, we see wickedness, we know that our God is all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, perfectly just. Why is there evil, right? And Habakkuk is just honestly saying to God, why is this before my face? He said, why do I have to look at this? And it's a great mystery, and it's a real question. And unless you're just not paying attention, you're going to have to ask God that question and struggle with the answer yourself. And the thing that, I don't know if this is appropriate or not, the thing that came to my mind when I was at this point in my preparation was the girl who made the testimony at Easter this year. What was her name? Ray, what? Ray song. So what was her story, right? She said, I was Christian, I drifted away from God, my life was going someplace else. Then God did something. He gave her cancer. And so this is her testimony. And so that brought her back to God, right? Now it happens she also, it seems, was cured of cancer, which is great, but it's not the greatest thing. The great thing is that God loved her so much that he would do what he needed to do to bring her back to himself, which is where eternal life is, right? And if you look at people in the Bible, David and Job and Jonah and everybody, just about, in the whole Bible, if you look at stories like Ray-san's testimony, I can think of things in my own life, not as spectacular as hers, but where I was severely bothered by God, the result being that I came back to God, right? It's a kind of pattern that we see. What God is doing to redeem a people for himself from out of the wicked world is such that we will always see wickedness in the world until God's finished what he's doing, right? God is allowing this wickedness to rule in the world. And it's under his control in the sense that it's not escaping his perfect plan and purpose. But he himself says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. Right? You can't just say God allows it as if it sort of happens and there's a sense in which God also causes it. Right? Not proximately, but at the root of it all, everything is going forward according to God's will. And so I think that's what we have here in Habakkuk, a prophet looking at the world around him and saying, God, why don't you do something? God says, I am doing something. You just don't like it. It's bothering you, but if you could see the world the way I see it, I think Habakkuk would approve. All right, so does anybody want to comment at that juncture? I don't think I've said anything wrong, but it is disturbing, and it's supposed to be.
Well, in all the aspects, whether it's the testimony at Easter, or every foreigner that comes to Japan, or even among the Japanese themselves, there's a sense of being uprooted from whatever is your norm.
Yeah.
That gives you a focus to see, who you are. So when they get thrown out of the land, they're being uprooted, they live in Babylon. The only thing they have left is God and spiritual truth and the Word, because everything else about them has been stripped away. That's all they can hold on to. So I think there's an awakening when the things that are common and comfortable, you just gone. What do you turn to? What do you do?
You're saying that the difficulty in their life is part of the redemptive process.
Yes, yeah. Because
I think so.
They can't lean back into their common ground and go back into their sameness or find that solitude. They're uprooted from it. Jerusalem is gone.
The worst. I say often enough, the worst thing God could ever do for you is to just let you continue in your sin and leave you alone. Right? That's a recipe for a bad eternity. But what God does do is go to great lengths to perfect and redeem the children for himself, people for himself from out of the world, and it looks like the world that Habakkuk sees. Later in the New Testament, when Paul quotes Habakkuk, he'll be saying the same thing. Yeah.
What we also see, Greg, thank you for recognizing us. This, I know, is not a direct part of our study at all, but with the rising of the Babylonians and the exile of the Jewish people, we read in the book of Daniel the incredible actions of God that even has Nebuchadnezzar turning to God and proclaiming his power as supreme in the earth. Would that have happened had the Babylonians not attacked Israel and God saying, okay, they think they're all powerful, let's show them.
Yeah, that's a truly excellent point, and to just continue on beyond that. And if this hadn't happened, Christ would never have come, and we'd all be dead in sin. So what God is doing is difficult at every point, especially for his children who look with the eyes of God at all the wickedness in the world. But God knows what he's doing. And that answers your question from last week, by the way, Jeremy, is Nahum wasn't talking about the Assyrians. He started in the time of Nebuchadnezzar II, at the beginning of the Babylonian Empire, looking forward. Thank you, Steve. That's right. So God is doing something, and Habakkuk is complaining, but he's hopefully going to understand better. So now Habakkuk comes back. Again, this is what I called in the outline his second complaint. And I'm going to read this. But before I do, I want to share with you what I decided is a fair one-sentence summary of everything that he's going to say is Habakkuk saying, yes, God, but why do it that way? See if that's a fair summary. So Habakkuk chapter 1 verses 12 through the first verse of chapter 2. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are purer of eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Chapter 2, verse 1. I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. And again, I think what Habakkuk is saying, God, why are you doing it that way? Okay, now let me talk about it in a little bit more detail. So if we come back to verse 12, we can see here the prophet is not disrespectful to God. He's not rude. In fact, he begins his whole second speech with doxology, that is, with praise of his God. Okay? Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? It's his God. God is holy. He's everlasting. This phrase, we shall not die, is a difficult point for the translators. Some translate it, you shall not die. In other words, you're everlasting. Some translate it, we shall not die, means we won't die because you're our God. People aren't really sure, but the point overall is that the prophet is not trying to disrespect God. On the contrary, everything about the prophet is wanting to honor God, and he begins to make that clear by saying these things, these prayerful, worshipful things about God in verse 12. And he continues on into verse 13, still in verse 12. He has a second thought there. He praises God, and also he makes it clear that he got the message that God delivered, right? He's not stupid. He understands that God has ordained them, the Babylonians, I guess, also the Assyrians, as a judgment. And he's established them for reproof. So God has said, I am doing something. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. They're going to do all this difficult, tough stuff. And Habakkuk says, I love you, God. I praise you, God. I understand that you're raising them up as a reproof, as a judgment. I get it. I got the point, what you said. All right. But in the middle, then in verse 13, he starts going in the other direction. He says, you are purer eyes than, you are purer you who are purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, still praising God. Now comes a question. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? So the prophet praises God. The prophet understands what God said to him about raising up the Chaldeans as a reproof. But he does not understand why his holy God would allow such evil and injustice to persist in the process. He doesn't understand that, right? Why do you remain silent? Why do you remain idle when these things are seen in the world, right? And to make his point then, he conjures up this figure of speech where he's basically saying, you're treating us like vermin, you're treating us like fish, all right? Verses 14 through 16, Habakkuk says to God, you make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler, right? Man is the pinnacle of God's creation, created in God's image. He's supposed to be dignified and orderly and ruled, to have God's laws, to obey, to be just, to be like God, right? That's what man was created for. He still has some dignity, the prophet, I think, wants to say, and yet God is raising up the Chaldeans who are going to do all of these horrible things, and the prophet is saying, you're making men like fish, all right? Like crawling things, like vermin, like bugs or whatever, that have no ruler. He, verse 15, brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. And you ask yourself, who is he? And if you read through, you'd have to say what, Michael? Who is he in the first instance? Jeremy? It's kind of a toss-up, isn't it?
Yeah, it's tricky. In my translation, it says they. New King James.
That helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Hebrew it says he, and you find yourself almost thinking he is God, because we've just been talking about God, but then as you read on, you realize, no, it's not God, because the way it finishes is talking about him enriching himself and so forth and so on, which is irrelevant with respect to God. So he must be Nebuchadnezzar, or he must be the Babylonian Empire that God is raising up. And Habakkuk's complaining because God is raising them up and they're going to treat people shamelessly, like vermin, like fish. But then you have to go back to the original thought and say, yes, but God is raising him up, right? And so, in a sense, it is God that's doing that through the instrument of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, right? And so, and that's why the prophet is addressing himself to God and saying, why? Why are you raising up this problem like this, right? So I think you have sort of both of those thoughts running there. God allows Nebuchadnezzar to treat people who are made in God's image as if they were fish or crawling things, and he makes himself rich. That doesn't make God rich, but it is something that God has caused to happen by raising up Nebuchadnezzar. And it is with all of the downstream and ultimate benefits, like Steve suggested earlier. It's part of God's eternal plan, which we can't rarely see all of it. Right? And so then Habakkuk comes back in verses 17 through the first verse of chapter 2. And he says, is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing the nations forever? I will take my stand at my watchpost, and so forth, right? And so the prophet understands that God is great and God is good. The prophet understands that God is doing something. The prophet understands he's raising up the Chaldeans. He understands all of the difficult things that will proceed from that. He understands it's a reproach. He understands God has a reason for doing it. He questions why God has to be so rough and allow men to be damaged. And not just Israel, I think. He's actually now, I think, asking on behalf of all humanity, it would seem. And so he ends by saying, how long, God? Does this have to continue forever? And that's the question that God has to answer next week when we read into chapter 2. And in answering this question, God says the things that Paul will quote in Galatians and in Romans, and will also be quoted in the letter to the Hebrews about the importance of living by faith. So this is really a situation that's calling Habakkuk and the other few godly men that are around there to have faith, because God is asking a lot from them, actually. He's not promising them anything except to be their God.
So is it kind of, I don't know, I'm not sure how well I'm following you teaching about that. So Habakkuk is kind of confused about how, so he has this local justice and wickedness problem that he talks about first. And then God's answer reveals this far away wickedness and evil thing that's going to happen as well to correct the local injustice. And then it seems to me like Habakkuk's response is kind of, well, that doesn't make the overall evil decrease in the world, that kind of stuff. Is that?
I think I understand your question. I think we've confused you by importing a lot of Christian theology back into the Old Testament. So from a Christian point of view, we can see the end of the story, which makes it easier for us to handle than it would be if you were a prophet in the 7th century BC, right? Who sees the world around him in a terrible shape, and he goes to God and says, why? Why is it this way, right? And the answer that he's getting is sort of like the answer that Job got. Well, because I'm God. And he's giving actually more than what Job got, because he's saying, I actually am doing something. You know, you're nervous about all of the things that you see under the Assyrians. The implication is he did that because he's also, next thing he's going to do is raise up the Babylonians, and there's going to be more of the same. The Assyrians will be overcome. Israel will still be punished for its wickedness, right? And the future that other prophets have looked forward to, the restoration and the salvation beyond all of the difficult times, is still in the future. And so the only thing that Habakkuk can do is to just trust God.
God's answer is just more bad news.
And he's just, more bad news. I mean, he's telling him, don't worry, because I've got everything under control. Whatever you see bad going on around you, I'm in charge of it. And so if you really love me, if I'm really your God, you're okay. The righteous shall live by faith. Hang on. Same thing Jesus said to the churches in the first 3 chapters of Revelation. Think times are tough? Hang on. Hang on. It's the message of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Keep hanging on. Just a second. So, Walter Brueggemann, one of my favorite Old Testament Bible scholars, says the provisional answer to theodicy is eschatology, by which he means that if you have a problem understanding why there's evil in the world, the answer comes at the end of time. Those of us who have the great good fortune of being Christians have light before the end of time. Or Dennis is always saying you have a receipt, and that kind of teaching us. But I mean, we have a lot more information that lets us have peace with whatever circumstances we have to live through, because Christ has gone ahead and died and risen again, and we know that there's an end to the story, which is good. Christians don't have to be at all afraid about dying. It's just a step in the right direction, right? But these guys have more to be uncertain about and more to be afraid of, because they don't have Christ yet. Not out in the open. But in the Old Testament, these guys are told the same message, which is, the righteous shall live by faith. Be faithful. Be faithful. Be faithful. Hang on. Hang on. Hang on. That's all he can do, is trust God. And that's all we can do too. But I am glad I'm asked to do that knowing Christ, first of all, rather than asked to do that 7 centuries before Christ will be born, which would have been a bigger challenge, I think. What was somebody was? Yeah.
If Habakkuk's word of God, in this case, you would have about like 80% that shows about God rescuing Israel constantly, and only this little small segment, the Nineveh and the Babylonian, this little bit. So I think his theology was, he will rescue us. There's a hope. There's that's all the Psalms. That's all of David. That's all the history of Israel. And he's got all this banking on, hoping this will not come about. I think most people don't like the open-endedness of things, and this is one that's really throwing Habakkuk for a loop.
And I think God forces us to deal with the open-endedness of things. I think even when Jesus was on the cross and said, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think at that moment he was right up against the open-endedness of things. You know, I mean, he knew God and he had faith in God, and he knew more than any of the rest of us. But it's the nature of human beings. I mean, we all walk up to the edge of death, and we've never been there before, right? And you know, all the theology in the world is not going to get you any farther when it comes to a time like that and say, God help me. Right? That's theology in a nutshell, you know, God help me. And if that's what you're hanging on to, you're fine, because he's the one guy who can help you, right? But he isn't always making it easy, and I don't either know why God chooses to do things the way he does them, but he doesn't make it easy for everybody anyway. Maybe it's different for every person, but